Good morning. My name's James Wilsdon. I'm Vice Chair of INGSA and based at the University of Sheffield in the UK. And it's a real pleasure to be able to join you virtually at this morning's meeting. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person because of other meetings going on here in London. But on behalf of INGSA, can I say how pleased we are to hear the details of the study that you're now embarking on, how useful that work will be to the wider goals of the network, and how much we look forward to staying in touch with and seeing the results of the work that you're doing. Many thanks also to Doyin and Angie and other colleagues at the Nigerian Academy for the invitation to join you, if only in this video form. I've attempted, after a few trial and errors with different technologies, to combine a few slides with talking to you by using my iPad to illustrate the slides. So we'll see if this works as we go along. But what I wanted to do in just sort of 15 minutes or so of introductory remarks was give a few thoughts and perspectives from the broader INGSA network on the changing landscape for scientific advice and evidence-informed policy making, some of the opportunities that we see in different systems around the world, and also some of the challenges that we're all very acutely aware of, particularly given some of the broader geopolitical trends that we see out there. So I'm going to try and sort of cram a few of these things into to 15 minutes. I hope this works. I was going to start by saying that I think we all, and I'm sure this is true in Nigeria as it is here in Brexit blighted Britain, we all feel a certain extent the challenge of talking about these issues at a time like this. This is a couple of examples of recent books on the death of expertise and post-truth that speak to a wider concern that's out there about a pushback against expertise and evidence in various regards. And I say here in the UK, we're living through a particular spasm of that with the ongoing traumas and uncertainties of leaving the European Union. So that can make it at times feel rather difficult to be talking about science advice. You know, are we kind of shouting into a void or pushing back against a very powerful countercurrent? At the same time, I think there are lots of examples, and we see these around the world, and here are a couple of examples of reports that have attempted to better understand the evidence for evidence provision, the science of scientific advice, if you like, trying to help us understand from all of these different systems and experiences over 10, 20 or more years of doing this stuff, what works, what doesn't, what we can learn from different contexts and apply elsewhere, and which things aren't transferable. You know, there's lots of contextual aspects to scientific advice that are actually quite rooted in the particular national political culture of a given system and which don't move easily. But we've got a lot more understanding of this system and these dynamics than we had a few years ago, and that's something to be positive about. Within INGSA as a network, we've obviously tried to encourage and accelerate that process of exchange and learning from different systems, and we're particularly delighted by the growth and development of the different regional chapters, including INGSA's African chapter, as an arena in which that kind of exchange and learning can take place. As I'm sure many of you are aware, INGSA as a network, see the website ingsa.org, was set up in 2014 following an initial conference in New Zealand. And that was really the idea behind its creation, that we had all of this activity going on around science advice and evidence and policy in all sorts of different places at all sorts of different levels of government. But very often we weren't capturing those lessons and moving them across from one context to another. So that's been the mission of INGSA since its inception, and it's now, of course, a large and growing enterprise. We have about 4,500 members, I think now from just over 80 different countries. And it's been fantastic to see the speed at which it's grown and the appetite there is for this kind of activity, which is also a counter-example to the more pessimistic account that says we're now living in a post-expert, post-truth era. If we think about the science policy nexus, at the core of INGSA's work are a number of assumptions. Firstly, that governments and decision makers more widely are likely to make better decisions if they have access to well-developed, robust sources of evidence and trained, skilled experts to act as intermediaries, brokers, transmission mechanisms of that evidence into the policy system. A second assumption is that virtually all challenges that governments face, whether they recognise them as such or not, have some kind of scientific and technological dimension. I think if we look across the piece in terms of, say, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, you see under each of them different dimensions that are amenable to the contribution of scientific evidence and expertise. But another core assumption that underpins all our work is that science alone does not make policy. A famous phrase from one of our former Prime Ministers here, Winston Churchill, science advisors should be on tap but not on top. In the political process, particularly in a democracy, there are quite legitimately a whole range of different values, political considerations, societal factors that need to be quite properly taken into account alongside evidentiary inputs of various kinds. So in pushing for better and strengthened science advice, we're not doing so in a way that perhaps naively trumpets science as the solution. We have to recognise the complex nature of many of these challenges and adopt a humble approach really to how we bring scientific knowledge into often difficult and tricky terrain. That said, in the context of certain governments around the world, and Donald Trump and others who seem to revel almost in the opposite of evidence-informed policymaking, we also, of course, face real challenges. The rise of populism in its various forms, a distinct pushback against expertise and elitism, as it's rightly or wrongly associated with experts, has definitely made this terrain more difficult and challenging over the past few years, and I'm sure it will continue to be the case. So we need to think about how we navigate both those opportunities, what we've learned from other systems, and some of the pushback that we see. Dwayne asked me to say a little bit about different structures of scientific advice, so I was just going to whip quickly through the main models. And of course, many national systems will deploy a mixture of these in their own context. We've had in quite a number of systems since the Second World War the role of the scientific advisor. And here we see that role in its most sort of emblematic, exemplary form. Barack Obama as president, walking side by side with John Holdren, his then scientific advisor, deep in conversation, no doubt, about important issues of the day. That sort of sums up that image, what we hope can be achieved through the office of a scientific advisor, a sort of individual key advisor to a leader or senior politician. Of course, that ideal isn't always achieved, and we've seen under Barack Obama's successor the difficulty of maintaining that model, even in a system like the United States that has had a science advisor pretty much non-stop since the Second World War. After the longest gap ever in appointing anyone at all to that office, there is now a new nominated science advisor, Kevin Drogemeyer, who's taking over in that role. But you find it hard to imagine this level of sort of proximity and close advice going on, perhaps between the current president and his new advisor. Who knows? Maybe I'm misjudging him. In the UK, we have had a similar role, a chief scientific advisor, since 1964. Currently, that role is occupied by Sir Patrick Vallance, and we also, since about 10 years ago, have had departmental scientific advisors in pretty much every government department, and this image sort of gives a flavour of some of those personalities. The one in black there in the corner, the darkened out one, is the science advisor in MI5. I do know who it is, but if I told you, I'd have to kill you. So we have these science advisors in different roles, and that system also has been adopted in quite a number of countries. And we see the role of national science advisor as well in a number of developing and emerging economies. But it's by no means the dominant model. It's something that is used, but it's not universally so. Even in Europe, big science systems like Germany and France don't have a single role of that kind. A second key element, retrieve my laptop from the floor here. A second key element in many systems is, of course, National Academies of Science. And I've just pulled off there the homepage of the Nigerian Academy is a very good example of that. We have national academies, of course, in not all, but most countries, certainly most countries with decent sized science systems. And again, we've seen over the past decade a real acceleration in the volume and quality of scientific advice that's coming from many of those academies to their respective governments and other decision-making authorities. So in an African context, in addition to the Nigerian Academy, ASAF in South Africa does very good science policy work. There are quite a number. And of course, there's then also collective groupings of national academies, both in a regional context and globally through things like the IAP, the Global Network of Science Academies. Sorry, these slides aren't coming through necessarily clearly. My own previous role, 10 years ago, I was Director of Science Policy at the UK's National Academy, the Royal Society, which in one way or another has been doing science policy since just about 1664. So they had a very long tradition of looking at these things. So that's a very dynamic area. The mode in which national academies tend to operate tends to be more suited to medium to long-term questions. It's quite hard. I don't know. I won't comment on the agility of the Nigerian Academy. Certainly speaking from the British context, it was always quite hard to get an organisation like the Royal Society to turn out an input to policy quickly. It's just, these organisations are not built for speed. They're built for robustness, for quality, for extensive review. But all of those things take time. So they have an important function in the science advice ecosystem, but they can't do everything that's required in the day-to-day mill and rhythm of politics and policy making. Many countries also have a range of different expert committees and councils. Often there will be a national science policy, innovation policy council of some kind. Example I was putting up there is from the Japanese system. The US has something equivalent. Many countries do. Sometimes they'll be more focused on the science and innovation funding system, policy for science, but also others do look at science for policy. And below that national level, those big committees will often be reporting straight into prime ministers or presidents or to senior ministers. Below that senior level, you will have, of course, often a large array of more technical specialist advisory committees in any system, looking at the detail of given areas of policy, whether it's food safety or environmental standards or any number of technical questions that require specific expertise and input. So they're an important part of the system. In Europe, if I can still speak about Europe collectively while we're clinging in as members by our fingertips, the big innovation institutionally over the last few years was the introduction of a scientific advice mechanism, which is also a committee type structure supported by various other elements in the European Commission in Brussels, and that's now been up and running 3 or 4 years and is working quite well. So you see that in a lot of systems. And then a final institutional element or option that I wanted to mention, this is above just the national level, is the growing significance and role of international panels and assessment bodies, the most well known of which, of course, is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been with us the longest. But there have been lots of other areas in which there have been calls for IPCC type structures, and some where such structures have actually been created, perhaps most notably in the realm of biodiversity. There was you see a call there from Nature back in 2010, wanted an IPCC for biodiversity. IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, was then set up and is now running. So those are some of the structures. I think it's important to emphasise, going back to my earlier point about the humility required in providing science advice to policymakers, that scientific advisors aren't superheroes. My slide I use for this point. They can't swoop into a difficult, complex policy problem and resolve it simply through the application of evidence or advice as some kind of panacea. That very rarely works. In fact, it can be very counterproductive often to sort of expect that or require that of the science system. So it's important to recognise that there are real complexities at this science policy interface, even while we've had lots of progress and experimentation of various kinds with new institutions and structures. What are some of those challenges? Well, some of them lie on the science side rather than the policy side. In science itself, we have, of course, a cascading, growing volume of science in terms of published papers. The published volume of science is doubling in just under a decade, every decade. So there's ever more stuff being put out there. Often it's ever more niche and specialised in terms of its contribution to particular subdisciplinary silos. And from the perspective of the policymaker, of course, a lot of that stuff is so specialist and niche that it's often very hard to navigate, interpret, and make sense of it in a broader policy context. If you can even access the stuff, of course, another problem for policymakers, and this is probably, even in Whitehall and Westminster here, I'm sure the same applies in the Nigerian system. Often policymakers won't even have access to most of this published stuff because it's behind paywall journals. So that's another part of the problem. Much of the science that's required for policy questions is what we sometimes talk about as postnormal science. This is building on the pioneering work of Funtovitz and Revets a few years ago. And we talk about it as postnormal science in the sense that it deviates from a more conventional account of the norms of science as defined by people like Robert Merton. The science required in those contexts, the science needed in those contexts, is often incomplete. It's full of areas of uncertainty. It's often urgent. It often brings with it big areas of contestation in terms of ethics and values. And this makes the sort of application of science to the policy question ever more difficult. At the same time, the policy process, of course, is much more complicated than we sometimes pretend. I mean, I work in a politics department in my own university. I teach public policy to students every year, and still in the teaching and the way we think about public policy, this notion of the policy cycle, as is often conveyed, is very powerful, and it's a useful device for at least thinking through what goes on in policy processes. Defining the problem, identifying options, selecting, implementing, evaluating, and then going around the process again. But of course, any of us who've spent any time in or around government recognise that the reality is not this neat policy cycle. It's something much more like this. And this is a diagram Peter Gluckman, the chair of INGSA, produced. You've got somehow in the back a notional, linear and organised system that should exist, but in fact, from all sides and at all times, it's being assailed by multiple inputs from different stakeholders, the media, the public, the short-term pressures of a 24/7 news cycle, all of which make the ideal of linear, organised, rational, evidence-informed, evaluation-based policymaking ever more difficult and hard to achieve. Policymakers, as a group, if one can generalise about them, often have limited bandwidth. They've just got limited capacity to engage with the technical detail of a question, limited manoeuvrability in terms of what they politically can do about it. They will often be in a situation of lurching from problem to problem rather than being able to sort of step back and look long term. And this, going back to academies, is a role that academies can play because they have, in a sense, that more long term horizon scanning function. They will, of course, also see evidence as only one of a number of inputs, and that's quite legitimate and proper that it should be the case. So what does this mean for how we do advice, whether one's doing it in a committee, as a science advisor, through a national academy, or in some other international fora? Much of what we emphasise through INGSA's work is that effective advisors are intermediaries, they're brokers, they're boundary spanners between different worlds and different languages. It's very rare as a scientific advisor, unless you're on some very specialist technical committee, that the advice you're giving draws on your own published research. Far more likely you are acting as a connection point, as a guide, as a navigator through these bigger evidence and expert systems, identifying where relevant knowledge may exist, making sense of it, compressing it, synthesizing it, and then communicating it more effectively to relevant decision makers. So the set of skills required to do that is a rather different set from that which gets you to be a good or excellent scientist in the first place. I mean, in a way, being a good scientist rewards being as narrow and focused and specialist in your very little area as you possibly can. And then you move into science advice, and suddenly what you're being required to do is a very different set of things. And so obviously some people can make that transition very effectively. For others, it's more difficult. And again, that's quite understandable. One wouldn't expect all scientists to be good scientific advisors. But we need to make sure that we are building the capacity and training enough of a cadre of people who can make that leap to ensure that systems work effectively. So that's very much a focus of what we try to do through INGSA's work. As I say, we've been delighted to see the growth and energy that's gone into the African chapter of INGSA. We very much welcome the work that you're embarking on future directions for scientific advice within Nigeria and Africa more broadly. I hope we can contribute and learn from the work that you're doing. We very much look forward to seeing the results. I won't go on longer because it's always hard watching long videos, but again, can I send my warmest wishes and regards to you all from London, and I wish you a very successful meeting. Thanks very much.